Hey, welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Good. Hello.
And hey, this week we are joined by somebody I've been wanting to talk to for a good long while now. His name is Stephen Wolfe. He is an independent writer. His writing has appeared in Modern Reformation, Mere Orthodoxy, Chronicles Magazine, and History of Political Thought. He and his family are members of the Presbyterian Church in America, and he wrote a book that I think all of you would be very, very, blessed to read. It's called The Case for Christian Nationalism. So welcome to our show, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and you know, one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you is because we have spoken a lot about like Christian nationalism just broadly, and I felt like most of the voices that we've had about Christian nationalism was all kind of one-sided, and your book, your kind of introduction, at least in my book feed, in my Twitter thread, you know, was sort of like the first kind of like sane, cogent counter argument to Christian nationalism I've seen so far and read so far. And you know, once your book came out, I bought it immediately, started reading through it, and just thought I need to talk to this guy. So I'm really, really interested in everything that you've got to say. But I do have to sort of like critique you a little bit about something in your book, and I'm just going to get it out of the way at the top. It was something I read at the very end of your book, and I'm just going to read this quote, and I'm going to have you maybe explain it so I can feel better about myself. On page 470, you wrote, "We have to do better, pursue your potential, lift weights, eat right, and lose the dad bod." And as one that is very proud of my hard-earned dad bod, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Oh, so that's never been the first question, but that's of all the things that I say in the book, that one actually did get some attention from people, which is interesting.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's just good practical advice. I think it symbolizes a sort of nutrition that I think we're somewhat kind of bound to, and we can actually break free from, and that is not good for us. It also represents sort of kind of sedentary lifestyle. And getting out and moving is important. Also, I think there's an aesthetic aspect to this. I think one of the appealing things, one of the ways I want to encourage the movement in Christian nationalism is for men to become strong, become fit. And in doing so, you become very kind of self-confident. There's a self-confidence aspect that's not just in your muscular tone, which that's not even the main point. That's certainly a bonus, but it's also the physiological effects from lifting weights and from being fit. I think creates a sort of masculinity that can make Christian nationalism a thing. Right? So I think there is that aesthetic aspect to it that I was hoping to encourage. But I think it's just good practical advice. I think young people, especially Zoomers, are interested in this fitness, and also some millennials. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think I do think it's actually very important. Like there has someone asked me one time, like, well, what do you think is like, what can we do now? And I was like, well, get in shape. And getting in shape creates this kind of bond between men that they can then kind of achieve great things together. So,
yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because I asked that question sort of jokingly, but also like I started going back to the James after they opened up after COVID, and James is my word for the gym. Like I'm not on a formal basis or informal basis with the gym just quite yet, so I go to the James, and I agree.
That's awesome.
I think actually like taking care of yourself, self-care kind of in that regards is really important. But more seriously, I probably didn't do a great job, at the onset, kind of introducing who you are, your education, your faith, and I'm curious if maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then why did you write this book?
So I mean, about myself, married, have 4 kids, live basically out in the woods in North Carolina, and went to graduate school at LSU. Before that, I was at West Point. Spent some time in the Army. And then, I spent a year at Princeton with this postdoc fellowship. So that's basically, I guess, there's probably more to me than that, but that's basic background. In terms of why I wrote the book, it's somewhat an accident in a way. It was one of those late night tweets where I said, "Hey, what would you guys think if I wrote a book on Christian nationalism, defending Christian nationalism?" And then a bunch of people said, yeah, you should do that. And I was like, oh, maybe I should. And then I get a message from Canon like, hey, send in a proposal and we'll consider it. So that's kind of how it happened. And I don't know if it wasn't for that outside on the porch smoking. I don't know what the smoke did to me. It was tobacco. That whatever, for whatever reason, I got the idea. That's how it came about. But it wasn't, I think, to be clear, it wasn't as if I was looking at what people were calling Christian nationalism, and then I said, hey, I want to defend that. It was more me thinking through, what does it mean? What does Christian nationalism mean, given my, what I affirm and my assumptions? And then so I was thinking, how do I defend this thing, at least it's more like a case for, not so much, it's not like I'm defending what other people are calling it, or what's saying is Christian nationalism. I'm trying to make a case for it using my own assumptions and my own premises. And so, but why? I think why take up this term that's a term derision? I mean, it was kind of dreamed up. It didn't originate from the left. The word was used in the 19th century, and it's used in the 60s and 70s, but that was mainly from the left. But it was positively, but it's used as negatively to say, oh, it's bad to be a Christian nationalist. But it seems to me, as I thought through it, that in fact it's nationalism is what Christians need at this time, and because even though there are bad elements of nationalism, the positive side of it is it does energize people to act. I think to act for their good. There's a sort of vitality to it. It encourages the people to reflect upon who they are, their place, their people, and from there to have a sense of need for action. So I'm not, even though most of my assumptions are very old, I think they taken from the Protestant Christian tradition. I use the word, it's not simply kind of a regurgitation of that old Christian Commonwealth sort of politics. It is nationalist, because I'm saying what we actually do need is this reinvigoration, this revitalization, so that Christians can then kind of assert themselves in their own good in the world. And so it's kind of a justification of that, especially in our moment when I think that Christian political theology is by design very weak. And in some ways it's intended to manage our decline. So instead of having the more assertive politics of the 16th, 17th century and beyond, even in the American founding era, it's this weak kind of, how do we manage our kind of loss of influence and power?
And
so I'm trying to offer the opposite of that, or the alternative to that. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but I have a lot to say. It's a 500-page book. I could keep going.
I'm sure, and I can only assume or guess, kind of in this current political environment, that your book was received well.
Yeah. Well, what was wild about it is I think it was reviewed by every evangelical kind of Protestant outlet, and it was not universally, it was mainly negative. Which I guess no author really wants that, But to my knowledge, it's the only book that has received that much attention. It's all been negative. That's interesting. And I really actually don't care. I mean, I'm glad I was reviewed, but it's an interesting, it says something about the book, whatever it says is up to people's thoughts, but it is unique. I can't think of another book that received that sort of attention. So somehow, for some reason, everyone needed to have a review of it, which I guess I hit something.
It was such a hot topic, right? And at least it became something in the national imagination, right? It's become something. And I guess my question, is how do you distinguish, one of the things you say is the book is not an action plan, it's a justification for Christian nationalism, and we're recovering, you say you're early in recovering the movement. And I'm curious as to what's the movement you're talking about, and distinguish for us, because so often, again, like Will said, it will be Christian nationalism will be painted in a very negative light. And so help us understand how that's an inaccurate picture, and what's the more accurate picture of what Christian nationalism truly is, at least the kind you're painting and the vision you're putting forward.
So your question, the way I interpret the question is my version as scary as the way the left paints it? And I'm not going to say it's less scary. So I'm not afraid to be scary. I think that's probably a different discussion. But I think so much of our political thinking, it's based upon people being scared, and what's safe and scary is instead of good and evil, it's safe and scary. But that's a different discussion. But I think. How's it different? I mean, first of all, it's an analytical tradition, based account. It's not, and it actually has a real definition, even though my definition is a little kind of complex and goofy. It's a real definition. It's not just a set of beliefs. It's not like a Samuel Perry, Whitehead, Gorski sort of, hey, here's 6 propositions, and if you affirm all of them strongly, then you're strongly Christian nationalist. And so I don't go about saying, I'll defend this. I don't really do that. It's a definition, and then over half the book is really just defending and explicating the definition for the most part. And then there's some supplemental chapters. But I mean, how it's different, I think, is that it's not, I don't really mention the United States until the last chapter of the book. And so it's not like this, hey, we're Americans and Americans Christian and Christian founding. I do have a chapter that kind of says that, but for the most part, it's just laying out the principles of Christian nationalism. So it's not about whether the Constitution was inspired. It's not whether the founders were Christians. It's not whether, not even should there be Bible reading in school. I do say there should be, but that's not the thing it's about. Ultimately it's about what is to my mind, what is Christian? I'll get to that. It's a Christian people who kind of self-affirm or affirm themselves as such, and they act for their good, and that good is earthly and heavenly. So earthly would be the temporal things of this life, and good jobs, and achieving one's vocation, civil justice, that kind of stuff. And then there's also the higher good, the heavenly good, which is the eternal life. And so Christian nationalism is a Christian people saying we're going to arrange ourselves for those ends, the earthly and heavenly ends. And the heavenly good is mainly procured through the church, instituted church. And so that's kind of the general definition. But how that looks in each context is going to differ based upon the people themselves, their characteristics, their circumstances, their experience, their history. So the United States has to be an American Christian nationalist, it would have to be kind of a disestablishment, generally speaking, at least at the national level. There would be wide toleration for dissent, and that sort of thing, just religious liberty. Whereas other countries may not follow that may not have that similar experience. So I'm not saying, it's not like I'm saying here's the blueprint, here are the laws, here's the specifications. It's more like here are the principles, here are the concepts. They're defended. They're basically rooted in the Christian tradition and also human nature. And now, as a Christian people in your own countries, apply those principles in ways that are suitable for your circumstances.
Yeah. So I guess, for starters, I'm a Democrat. I tend to vote more progressive. Josh is, the conservative of the group. He's the pastor. But him and I are both sort of bound by our faith. I mean, it's kind of like it's the premise of our show. It's like not right, not left, but up. And as a believer, I think one of the views that I've held about Christian nationalism is that it's always kind of like it's always seen in a negative light, and I don't know if that's the result of mainstream media or just people of my political affiliation, or whatnot, just making it look bad. But like when you see stuff like folks storming the Capitol, they've got Jesus flags and all kinds of other stuff, and you're just like, wait a minute, like that's the same Jesus I worship. That's the same Jesus I believe in, and I get upset because I feel like the way that it's being portrayed is very negative. So my mind just naturally goes to, okay, they're portraying my Christian faith in a negative light, kind of in the in the name of nationalism. And then for me, I kind of connect the dots between, okay, Christian nationalism equals bad. So I'd be interested to kind of hear, why is that wrong? And is there a different way to kind of view, Christians that are public about their faith doing really, really dumb things?
Yeah, I'm first on the January 6th thing. I think Daniel Strand wrote a piece for the American Conservative. It's a very long one. And he basically demonstrates that Christian nationalism, quote, Christian nationalism, was not the driver of the January 6th riot. And so it's Daniel Strand. I don't remember the title, but it was in American Conservatives. It was a very good piece. He's a political scientist. The same thing, Mark David Hall, who's also a political scientist, he's done work and wrote stuff on this, and he also thinks that that it was not a main driver. Certainly there are people who had. As from what I could tell, it was the shaman guy was the figurehead of it. And I know I'd call that Christian. Yeah. Right. So I just think that would just be a false narrative of January 6th. But even so, there certainly were people caught up in this kind of bizarre, almost like uniting Jesus, like Trump and Christ together in ways that were wrong in principle and in application. So, and that's going to happen. And the question is, what were those people? Would they say that they're Christian nationalists? Also, again, if the principle is that there's a few people who say they're part of some movement and they do something bad, and that should taint the entire movement, well, then there's probably several different other examples that principle would apply to that would be unfavorable to the left. So I think we can all agree that principle is problematic and is kind of double-edged. So, but yeah, to say that, I think, to be frank, I think that Christian nationalism, as I've described it, most people on your side, the Democrats, would find it bad. So I can't actually dissuade. The only way to dissuade that it's bad is to convince them to abandon a lot of the things they actually affirm. So yeah, they're not going to like aspects of Christian nationalism. Where I don't think we should have like wide toleration of atheists, for example. I think that in a Christian public school ought to be Christian, and in doing so, that means that atheists would be denied the ability to be administrator or teach there. And so so there are things that they will not like. I can't convince. I'm not going to go through this like exercise of trying to convince a secularist left that, oh, Christian nationalism is not scary to you. Like, no, it's scary to you. I mean, it should be scary because it literally contradicts their belief system entirely, and it would drive them from power. I mean, so I'm not interested in sharing power with someone who wants to who is essentially has secularist and all this sort of beliefs they tend to have. I think they should be marginalized through both social and political power. So I can't convince your side. I mean, I know that would sounds extreme, but I think Christians once widely held that. I think our founding fathers, the idea that and also the 19th century, this is really just a weird late 20th century thing where we tolerate these people. And it's the things we tolerate in the last 10 years is pretty wild itself. But yeah, I mean, I think really I mean, if you think like, oh, he wants to jump back in the 17th century or 16th. No, I really just want to go back in maybe like early 20th century or maybe 19th century in certain regards. So anyway.
Is that another way of that? Is that another way of saying you want to make America great again?
Yeah, sure, I guess.
No, so that's fascinating to me. You give a definition of Christian nationalism, page 9 of your book, and I'll just read it for clarity's sake. It says, Christian nationalism is a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. And you had alluded to that in the beginning when you were kind of just defining what Christian national was as you were speaking out. So I guess one of my questions is, as we're looking at like social customs conducted by, the civil laws and social customs, like what does that begin to look like? Even so, like you started to get into it, like atheists, like, they wouldn't be able to, teach at a public institution or whatever. So what would like an atheist be able to do? Like what kind of laws would be there? What kind of like tolerance of like other religions, religious freedom? Kind of walk us through some of that in this vision that you're putting forward.
Yeah, I mean, just to start with principles and applications. So again, it'll look different in different places, and that's not me trying to evade the question. It's just true that what works here and what's appropriate here, what may not be appropriate elsewhere. So, but I think what is possible is I think, I mean, the reason I kind of point out atheists in particular is I think that it's more of a universal thing, that in a Christian nation, atheists would not be tolerated as in public institutions. And so I think there would be a sort of exclusion to a certain extent of atheism. I think it would also be just like socially costly. So you read Tocqueville when he's commenting on democracy in America, and he talks about the prevalence of Christianity in the United States. He says that people they may not be believers in their heart, but they're believers externally, because it was kind of socially kind of costly to not be a sort of believer, some theist in some sense. So I think that would be something good to return to. And we of course exist under similar dogma, not similar, but like dogma. So if people nowadays, if you oppose gay marriage, or now even if you think transgender is actually a mental illness, that is costly to you socially. And I'm not against that in principle. That is, that things can be socially costly. I just think the right things ought to be socially costly. And I think one of those things would be affirming the existence of God and that sort of thing. So I guess, so to kind of conclude, a Christian nation, the ism of the Christian nationalism would be kind of working to kind of undermine the positions that would subvert kind of a Christian people and Christian institutions.
And so some way, and I don't want to say the word coercion necessarily, but you have, so in some way it would be like, hey, here's this social norm of what brings honor and social norm of what brings shame, because every, right, even though we're not an honor shame culture in that sense, that still very much influences us, those concepts, and a social socially ostracizing, like almost making it so atheism in America isn't really even a viable option, like culturally. Is that kind of the idea? And I guess even expanding it to and I would assume that like Muslims, go ahead.
I was going to say, I got a notification on my end that said for some reason, Stephen, your browser stopped recording. So can you do me a favor and just like refresh your browser and see if that will work? It's really weird. I don't know why it was a notification that popped up on my end. Let's see if that works. Okay. Yep. You're good to go.
I see you now.
I've had some weird internet troubles last night. But
it's okay.
So, okay.
I totally get it. So what I was saying though, so like even, I guess in what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just like understand like totally, not only like the idea, the theory, but then of course the implications, because that's what, in order for a vision like to make sense, you have to see how it's lived out. And so one of my questions, so I would assume would the same kind of thing go for someone that was like Muslim, someone that was Jewish, someone that was Hindu, something like that? Like, is it basically that like public offices and places of significant influence and power in the civil realm, in the public sphere, government, that kind of stuff, versus a private sphere?
Yeah,
or would it even extend into the private sphere? What's the?
Yeah.
Because I think that people get concerned about, well, what does that actually mean? I got Muslim neighbors, I got Muslim friends, I got Hindu friends. What help us understand?
Yeah, I think that within public institutions, just take like a school, it would be a broadly Christian school, and it would be public so that it would take everyone, and there'd be exemptions available within public schools, so that if you don't want to pray or participate, or you're Jehovah's Witness or whatever, you would have to participate. And then there would be no one would be, I think, no one would be coerced to in order to belong in prayers or read the Bible or that sort of. I mean, yeah. Anyway, and then people would be free to have their own schools. You have Jewish schools and Muslim schools, and they could do that. In terms of political office, again, I think that I'm not so much against there being religious tests for public office, but it really depends on. I think if you could have like, do you affirm the existence of God and afterlife, that kind of thing. That's what in many states and had in the 19th century. I think some still even have that officially. They don't apply it, so it's never been challenged. It has to be brought to a court. They can't just. So
right.
I think Tennessee is one of those states. But yeah, something like that, and there could be a religious, like a Christian qualification. But I think that the thing is, when you already have like a Christian norm, having someone who says like a Jewish politician that represents you is actually not as much of would not be actually necessarily threatening to a Christian people. So it's not. In some ways, I think that a confident Christian people can be actually very tolerant of people who disagree, if Christianity is the sort of norm, the social and political norm. Because then the people who are non-Christians then are really they're really kind of no threat to the order. So I mean I know I don't know if you want more specifics again.
No,
or are you trying to find?
I just like hearing it because I'm trying to understand it. For myself, like some people say Christian nationalism and they say it, and I think they expect me to be horrified and disgusted, and other people say it, and as a pastor, they expect me to be on it and have the sticker that says, my country, my gun, my Bible, or whatever. And I just think, what is, and I'm just trying to understand it so I can get an accurate view of both sides of this so I can speak intelligently.
Yeah, well, I think the opposite side.
Yeah.
I mean, the opposite side is the whole kind of religious neutrality. It's really secularism is the opposite. It's not even neutrality. It's that the schools, in principle, are secularist, right. And then Christians are tolerated, and even in that sense, not well tolerated, and that would be the opposite side, and that's actually very new within American politics. I mean, prior to the incorporation doctrine, which happened, I think, 1946, 45, there were religion was a part of public life and was a part of education, and yeah, I mean, it was so. The idea of secularism itself, the idea that we American Christians have to commit ourselves to it, is a very recent phenomenon. And there are people still alive today. They're old, but they read the Bible in elementary school and in school, and they prayed in school until the court, kind of universally applied the First Amendment to not only the states but also the counties. I mean, to the extent that the Supreme Court even said that I forget what the case was, but it was a Supreme Court case where a football team, a student-led prayer could not be conducted prior to a football game, high school football game. So that's even at the very local school district. That's not even so.
Yeah.
My point is that's all very new. Like, I don't know why we have to, as Americans, have to commit to that.
Yeah, that was I know what you're talking about. That was a Bremerton versus Coach, whatever. We did an episode on that because like that I used to live there. Like,
okay.
A couple years ago, and that high school was like just down the block from where I lived at. So it was really kind of cool just to kind of, I don't know, just.
So you confirmed I didn't just make that up. So that's good.
I confirmed. Yeah, okay. You can fact check that.
Yeah.
But, so in your book, you do talk a little bit about modern theonomy, and I'm wondering if maybe you can kind of tell us what that is and how it's related to Christian nationalism. I mean, mind you, like I didn't grow up in the church. I mean, I gave my life to Christ on my wedding day in 2008. So, and I married a PK. So my wife's a pastor's kid. And, so a lot of these terms and whatnot are even still very unfamiliar, to me. And I'd love for you just to kind of unpack that.
Yeah. What was fascinating is that people, when they first heard of the book, they assumed that I was a theonomist, a dominionist, a reconstructionist, whatever, post-millennialist. There's a whole list of things that actually I'm none of those things. It was kind of funny. And because then they pick it up and they see me quoting Thomas Aquinas and folks that are like, I don't quote any 20th century theologian. And those are all 20th century theology. Theonomy, I would say, I call it modern theonomy because I think there is a sort of theonomy you find in the classical Protestant tradition. But usually when they think of theonomy, it's God, the law of God. It's, to put it like crudely, and some theonomists won't like this, or simplistically, it's taking the Mosaic Code and saying that ought to be like the standard set of laws for our law book, and it's universal, so that every single nation or every kind of jurisdiction should have these laws in place. So God already gave us the laws; those are the laws, and pertaining to the civil, like judicial sort of laws, not the ceremonial laws. And then there's other theonomists who say, well, yeah, you take those, but then the way you enact civil law is by contemplating the Mosaic Code and kind of deciphering the sort of general equity of it, given the circumstances. General equity meaning kind of the underlying principles, and then apply it into the civil realm. So that's theonomy. There is that sort of thing does happen in classical Protestantism. So you see that, like, Calvin, of course, is quoting would quote the Old Testament and the law to justify civil laws, and you see this all throughout. Yep. There's a book called The Mosaic Polity by Franciscus Junius, where he basically says that this is from 1610 or so, where he's a Reformed theologian, and he says, yeah, so these laws can be a sort of guide to us thinking through civil law and universally in every single polity. But all these guys, and the difference though is they all affirm natural law, so that they believe that the judicial law itself is actually rendered obsolete by the gospel. So it was a time and place circumstances for the Jewish people, and the gospel then kind of made it obsolete. But making it obsolete doesn't mean that it's not still relevant. It's still relevant because it represents a sort of perfect body of law that then can be an aid in determining what sort of civil law each civil polity ought to have. But ultimately, the universal law is natural law, and that needs to be applied given the circumstances. And that's why I keep saying that, if this was a theonomist work, it would be largely a list of laws we ought to enact.
Right.
Whereas I don't do that. But the natural law is a set of principles, and from which you then look at the circumstances, see what's necessary. You treat laws as a means to an end. And the means can change given circumstances, like everything in life. We change course when the whatever we were doing before is not going to achieve the end we're seeking. So we change course to. So the same thing with civil law in different places. You can have different law. Like I just heard that this is an example. When I grew up in California, my uncle used to do abalone diving. He'd get abalone up. And it was somewhat regulated at the time, but it wasn't heavily regulated because few people did it. It wasn't this big thing. People did. I think you can only take a certain amount at a time. But I heard recently that actually a new law made it almost illegal because people were just taking more than they were allotted by law. And so that's an example where one law worked, whereas kind of laissez-faire, and now you have to have a stricter law because there wasn't a preservation of the abalone population in the sea. So that's just an example of how you have to have changed laws given circumstances to achieve the same end. And anyway, sorry, I keep going.
Yeah,
but it's not but there is a sort of natural law theonomy where you're saying, yeah, the Old Testament is a perfect example of law, but it's obsolete as a totality. But we can take the individual laws as sort of just determinations that we might want to apply ourselves. So when you think about laws, you think about reason and scripture, and anyway, my work is not theonomist in that sense.
So you're not a
theonomist
in that modern sense. That makes sense. So
no, and that just makes me connected to the Reformed theology prior to the 20th century. Because theonomy is, in my estimation, it is a 20th century phenomenon. It's reaction to Roman Catholic natural law and secularization, and the need for a solid standard. Like theonomists like to say, well, by whose standard? Like if I were to say natural law, by whose standard? It was an obsession. No, I wouldn't say it's not fair. It was a concern over the standard that I think in the past there wasn't that sort of angst or concern about that. So
yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, when I'm thinking about like Jesus and the how he came to earth and what he did and the kingdom that he said he was establishing, and that's essentially what he came, right? The gospel was the gospel of the kingdom. It was that the kingdom of God's at hand. Repent, believe the good news, and come. But interestingly, he declined to create a physical, right, like a political rather, and national presence. And my question is, so how do you work through like the scriptures, what Jesus' action is, and then moving forward to today? And I'm super curious as bring me the connections there and the teachings or whatever it is. and I know you have, I'm sure many of the stuff, in your book and people can read it, but trying to give them a little bit of a, what is it? Salt that makes them thirsty. So they'll go out and buy the book, dude, and try to figure it out. So you don't have to give everything away, but give, enough, like what, is there a tension there for you? Or how do you solve that tension, or is there not a tension for whatever reason?
Yeah, I don't like tensions in theology. It's my overly analytical side. So I always try to resolve everything.
I understand that. Yeah.
So Christ came to essentially establish a kingdom. But I think the important point is that the kingdom is not of this world, which everyone affirms, because that's what it says in Scripture, right? Nevertheless, there still is this outward kingdom that concerns itself with justice and good laws and the suppression of vice, and it still involves earthly goods that are real goods that we of course should subordinate to the highest goods, but we don't want to. We're not commanded to seek earthly evil. So we're not, it's like we're not commanded to go walk into martyrdom. That is, like, oh, they're martyring over there. Let's go run over there and get martyred. So we're not commanded to do any of that stuff. And so the reformers, you can go farther back and say there's two swords. There's a spiritual sword and the civil sword, and the civil sword concerns the goods of earthly life, and the spiritual sword concerns the good of the highest good. And so this was then reflected in the reformers as two kingdom theology, so that Christ is the king, but there's a sort of two modes of reign, meaning that there's a spiritual and there's a temporal. And the temporal is mediated through civil government or civil rulers, so that there is actually, Christ does reign over the nations as a sort of civil ruler, I guess, but it's mediated through government. And that government's responsible to Christ for the good of the goods of this world. And then there's a spiritual kingdom where Christ reigns immediately, meaning that there's no pope. He's the sole mediator of in the kingdom. He's kind of the sole king without mediator. And the ministers are not sort of mediators. They're more like servants or heralds, or they're a different sort of thing than a civil ruler. And that's just standard classical, like, Protestant thinking. And so I think that's how you sort of resolve that, alleged tension, is that, Christ came, there's violence cannot, like, physical violence cannot bring about true faith. You can't coerce people to the faith. You can't hold them a gunpoint their head and say, believe or perish. Not only, I'm saying it's unlawful to do it, first of all, but it's also impossible as an effect. Like, you can't physically force someone to believe something, because belief involves knowledge and an actual assent, and also in the gospel, in the case of the gospel, it means actual trust, real faith in Christ. So you can't do that. So just to be clear, so Christian nationalism is not, as I call it, and I don't know anyone else who calls it that would affirm otherwise. It's not coercing people into the faith through any sort of violence. So I do think can be social nudges, but that's a different question. But it's not physical violence. But that's true of the spiritual kingdom. I mean, you're not going to become a child of God. You're not going to become a true member or elect of Christ's church through compulsion. And so those are the two kingdoms. But I like the civil realm can say you drive on this side of the road. It can say this is evil, this is good. You can be praised for doing good things. You could be the greatest, like, war hero, but also, like, in your heart hate God. So you could be praised outwardly for your great heroism, but then your heart actually be very far from God. So there is that separation of kingdoms that I think accounts for what's in Scripture. There is a sort of Caesar. There's a Caesar, and there is a church, and those are separate. And but part of the idea of Christian nationalism is that there is a responsibility of the civil ruler to care for the souls of people, to care for the souls. And that's not by administering sacraments. It's not by preaching. It's not by coercing people to faith. It's by establishing outward conditions that are conducive to faith. So Sabbath laws is the kind of key example of no one works on Sunday, which in itself is not, I mean, the law itself isn't spiritual. The law itself doesn't make anyone Christian or worship God, but it removes the sort of things that hinder you from that. It's just like the sound guy, analogous. The sound guy in church doesn't want that buzzing to go, some that buzz sometimes they do. Why don't you want that? You don't want that because that distracts you from hearing the sermon. All you can hear is that buzz for 45 minutes or however long the sermon is. They take that out because it's a distraction. Of course, like civil law is a little more coercive, but it's the same idea, is that you remove that temptation to go to a restaurant. I mean, we all have that, and I'm Presbyterian, so we're not supposed to do that. That's the kind of thing I have in mind. I don't know how I got to Sabbath laws, but yeah, go ahead.
No, it's so funny. And like, I was laughing because, I mean, having been part of multiple worship teams and whatnot, it's like, there are stories anybody that's been on a worship team can tell about sound and how the bass is never loud enough for the people on stage. And, it's too loud for the audience members. And anyways, but I want to, kind of circle back to something that you said earlier regarding, all the different isms or istics that people have called you, after writing this book, and just number one, just kind of apologize for, maybe the broader community, for people that, have a hard time wrestling with views or opinions that are different than theirs. I mean, it's the whole premise of our podcast. I mean, I don't agree with much of what Josh believes politically, and I'm sure he doesn't agree on much of the stuff that I believe as well. But when you mention that, some people have called you like a dominionist, I'm not sure what
dominionist. Okay.
Yeah, that'll work. And like, I'm curious if you can kind of expand on that, because in my mind, in order to really kind of see the total fruition of Christian nationalism or Christian nation, there has to be an apparatus or a vehicle to kind of help create that. And to me, it seems like Dominionism, or even like, the Seven Mountains Mandate, would be that vehicle. So I'm curious if you can maybe, connect the dots, if there are dots, and if not, then what's the apparatus to see Christian nationalism manifest itself?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't really care that I've been accused of any of those things. Just to clarify, I calling me a dominionist or a theonomist, I don't care. It just shows. It was just funny because I guess your side, I mean, they have a set of terms, and all these things are bad, and they most people don't even know what those things are. But when they find that there's, a more like right-wing Christian who wants Christian politics and Christian this and that in public life, those are the go-to terms to start describing things. And it's just, in itself, it's not ignorant, but it's ignorant with regard to what my project is. So I don't really follow. I just thought it was funny that like people on tweets, so he's this, like, no, I'm none of those things. But anyway, but yeah, I think what you're saying. Yeah, this is one of the problems with the term Christian nationalism, is that it's hard. Like, dominionism can kind of have a definition, theonomy can kind of have a definition, that even though the theonomists would fight, and they love to fight, they would kind of, generally speaking, if you can get them on their good side or two beers, they'd say, yeah, I affirm that. Christian nationalism is not that sort of thing. And but that's because it's a second book, but it's the first long book that's been trying to argue for it. And so maybe more will come of it. But yeah, I think if someone wanted to, but I mean, yeah, it's just, if someone wanted to say, what is my account? Fundamentally, it is kind of a nationalist version of old Presbyterian politics, political thought, or classical Protestant political thought, which people don't really know. And because it's the revival of all that is somewhat new. So it's hard for me to give you like that definite, this is what it is. But I mean, like Dominionism, it would be wrong to start, listing names and say Wolfe's influenced by these people. But there is an aspect to where Dominionism, as the term itself, would kind of fit what I'm going for. That Christian nationalism is a fulfillment of the Dominion mandate, and that what this means to subdue and multiply on the earth is to create nations that honor God. And since the true God is the Christian God, is the triune God, then to fulfill the mandate, you establish nations that honor the triune God. There is something to calling it dominion that actually makes sense. It just would be false to say, hey, all these guys in the past use this term. So
that makes
maybe in a few years we'll get a better term. And I'll say on the term Christian nationalism, I'm not like wedded. I argue for the case, but I'm okay with people using other terminology. I just hope they would affirm the same principles. So if you don't, if you say, oh, that term's tainted or this and that, and I think there are a lot of people who agree with a lot of what I say, but they just don't want to connect themselves with the term, which I can understand. It's reasonable.
Sure.
But they still affirm the ideas, which is fine.
Yeah,
it's not like I'm looking to start like a political party called the Political Party.
Yeah. the Christian Nationalist Party.
Yeah, I'm not a very good political leader. First of all, I'm an academic.
Sure.
I'm not. I don't write these things just for fun. I do actually believe what I say. Unless you show it's false, and there's a few things in there people have shown that are false. But generally speaking, I believe what I'm saying, and I do want to see it come about. It's not an intellectual exercise for me, but at the same time, I'm not exactly a great movement leader. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I understand. So, and this is my last question, but and you kind of alluded to it, sounds like in your previous answer. What's the end game? Like, what I mean is the end game that this movement spreads organically so that every country in the world becomes a Christian nation? I mean, obviously, so when I'm thinking about like world evangelism, in my heart, like we would want everyone to become to find the love of Christ and to experience his grace and to be welcomed into the kingdom of God. Our enemies, our friends, everyone, right? That's the heart of the gospel. At least to the people, like what no matter what you believe, you at least believe in God's love in terms of like whether Calvinist or Arminius, that he has great, like inexhaustible love. And that, that we would hope that everyone would come. Like Paul would say, I hope that everyone would be like me except these chains. My question is like, do you feel like that's realistic? Like, do you think that it will happen? Or is this like a truth? I need to bring this out just because this is my job? Or do you imagine like how do you see this actually working itself out?
Yeah. I'm asked, connected to this question is kind of like, how do we proceed from here? So first of all, I'm not a fully convinced post-millennialist who tends to think, of course, this will happen. I'm actually kind of more amillennial, but more optimistic. And my concern, even though we have to seek to achieve the end. If you're going to act politically for a Christian nationalist end, you have to actually believe it and seek it. I think part of the dignity of being a true Christian movement is striving for this, because in itself, the process itself is actually dignifying. And I think we've lost that dignifying aspect to Christian politics because we've become weak and very kind of submissive. And so I think that the process itself, I don't want that to be like a cop out for failure, but I think that is true. It's also not an excuse just to be foolish and fail. Yes, you actually have to be wise and prudent in your actions. I think the perfect would be, yeah, every nation is Christian on the earth. But I think the point is that we ought to, if anything, I think the first step is changing our mindset when it comes to the Christian assertiveness in public space. I don't think that even though I said like decades ago there were prayers in school, and I understand there's some problems in applying that and all that, but just the thought of that, which was again within people's lifetimes today, it bothers Christians of later generations. You ask a millennial or Gen Z or Zoomers, hey, can we do this? And they react as if it's the worst thing you could possibly do. So I think we have to change our mindset, and it's like a psychological thing where you have to kind of critique ourselves and say, wait, no, why am I affirming these things that no one affirmed until a few decades ago? And we have to kind of change that mindset. So I think it's a mental thing, psychological thing that kind of is the groundwork for later action. But will it actually achieve? I think within history, if you have the principles, you have the will for it, it will happen in places. And I think it can happen in the United States. And how exactly that'll come about, I think that we have to think more about it and be prudent in how we bring it about. I say it in the last chapter, basically the last chapter, epilogue, I say the opening, I'm an academic guy. So there's got to be other people I can't be the sole guy who says what we ought to do. I can't be the final word on how we ought to bring this about. And there are people
you're our leader.
Yeah, no.
You're our leader now.
No. Well, I mean, yeah, but you think like a military unit, like even the infantry, right? The infantry, they have their guys, they have their leaders, they have their chaplains, they have their supply, logistics, they have the mechanics, they have the military intelligence guys. Even an infantry unit that faces the enemy in warfare has several different specialties within that unit as something organic to the unit. And so any movement, and I think any Christian nationalist movement, has to have its foot soldiers, has to have its, intelligence officers, whatever, in order to succeed. And so I've always just encouraged people to think, okay, if you agree with me or you agree with this thing broadly, what's your part in this overall movement? I'll try to write the books and other things, but anyway.
That's awesome. As a former 11 Bravo myself, I can attest to everything that you said. So
okay, you're confirming again what I'm saying. This is great.
I should just follow you around and just confirm stuff.
Yeah.
Just like I could be a motivational speaker. So yeah, my last question for you, and it's something that you wrote in the last chapter of your book, and I'll just read it here. It says, "If I were unmarried and childless, I would not have written this book. This book is not an intellectual exercise, nor intended simply to contribute to the field of Christian political theory. It is personal. It is a vision of the future, and my family is a part of that future. My motivation was not abstract justice or humanity, but real people whom I love. The love for my own and my family most intensely animates this whole work." And I think that really kind of encapsulates a lot of what I read and a lot of just what I'm getting from just you as a person, as a human, as a believer. But I am curious on like why, so if you didn't have kids and if you weren't married, like what would be different about your view about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. The difference would be found in chapter 3, which is when I talk about the nation. Is what informed that chapter was this sense of an intergenerational connection from grandparents, great-grandparents, and then into the future for my children. So when it's a phenomenal, I call it a phenomenological account of place, people and place. And I think that's what a nation is, not just a set of people at any given time. It's a people who have a history. In fact, it's the history being together that constitutes a nation. So like I kind of have a disputed notion of what ethnicity is in there, but it's kind of a non-racial thing where it's really the way that people have cooperated over time in a place that unites a people in a place. But that's generational. I mean, there is a sense in which the most intense sense of that this piece of ground matters comes from the fact that you have an intense affection for your own loved ones, where your father worked in a certain shop or store or farmland or that house and that property. And then you could also think about your own, like, so we own a few acres, and there's times when, I mean, it kind of might be romantic and silly, but there's times when I think about what I'm doing on this property is me leaving an imprint, especially when I do it with my kids. Like, we're building a goat shed. My 6-year-old son is very helping really well. And I'm hoping that there's some kind of glimpse of a memory that he can remember. Oh yeah, I built this thing with Dad. Maybe I should not let it fall over in 30 years or whatever, and look at it and say, wow, Dad's terrible, a builder. I'm sure that's what they're going to say, actually. But anyway, there'll still be that affection, in a sense, imprinted into the actual place, into the building, the structure, because he built it, that is me, and I was a part of that. And I think you can take that same phenomenon, that phenomenology, and combine that out into a town, a city, a state, even a nation. And I think in the military, I mean, now that I know you were in the military, like, as 11 Bravo, you worked.
Oh, yeah, just yeah. For some reason that happened again. Just reset again like you did before. So weird. Lots of editing going on. All right. Let me see. Okay. All right. Yep. I think you're good to go. Go ahead.
Okay. Just last thing. So, like, as being 11 Bravo, you worked with people in infantry who from all different states. I mean, I know what state you're from, but I'm guessing from all across the country. And that being in the military and having that sort of camaraderie with people who are from different places, it does kind of give you, at least for me, a sense of the nation, being part of it. Everyone volunteered. You're working on this together, and you struggle together. And I don't know if you're deployed, but there's. So anyway, yeah, that's my point. So there is like that. So a long story short, I keep going on and on, don't I? The reason I mentioned my kids is that I don't want to think my thinking is informed by this intergenerational connection of people in place, that I think we all should have that. And I think if we did have that, we would be more assertive in saying this is ours as an American people. So,
wow, that's awesome. Well, Mr. Stephen Wolfe, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. This was a pretty fantastic
thank you.
Discussion, and I guess what's next for you? Are you writing a chapter 2 or doing a speaking tour? What's going on?
Yeah, I have a couple more speaking engagements. I don't know if I can announce them yet in April. But yeah, I'm thinking about writing a book on hospitality. Actually, it'd be weird, but I know that's funny. Huh? But yeah, it's not a joke; it's real. Yeah, it's going to be how to prepare spaghetti for the church family. No, it's gonna be more than that. No, but more than that, hopefully. But that's what I have. But I mean, I appreciate you guys having me on as a controversial guy, I guess, and speaks highly to you guys. You can, have guests who are not just going to say
what the
standard stuff, I guess.
Rap sheet is, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, the rap sheet. Oh, that too. Yeah. My greatest hits. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. Go out and buy the book, Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe.
Whether you agree or disagree, buy it and read it and actually engage in an argument.
Yeah, and we will put the links in our show notes. And thank you to all of our listeners. We will see you next week. Take care.